a new opportunity to bring recent summit results to fruition while improving the welfare of Chinese and African people. Those were the remarks made by Chinese President Xi Jinping in a congratulatory letter to those at the coordinators meeting on the implementation of the FOCAC summit in Beijing Tuesday. During the opening ceremony, Chinese State Council and Foreign Minister Wang Yi read the letter and delivered a keynote speech, saying he also believes this meeting will deepen friendship and trust and boost high quality and sustainable cooperation.
We always believe that China-Africa cooperation is part of international cooperation with Africa. It will not only contribute to the common development and shared interests between China and Africa, but will also create conditions for greater international cooperation. China will encourage the international community to treat Africa equally and increase investment in Africa. We will work with others to pour our strength, form synergy, and help with the development and rejuvenation of African countries, and make life more colorful and rewarding for the African people.
The Chinese and African sides both signed cooperation agreements during the meeting and issued a joint statement. While answering questions from CGTN during the press conference, Qian Keming, China's Vice Minister of Commerce, shared details of the first China-Africa Economic Trade Expo to be held in Changsha City, Hunan Province.
The theme is win-win cooperation for a closer China-Africa partnership. During the expo, there will be an opening ceremony and China and Africa Economic Trade Cooperation Forum. There will also be 4 seminars on agricultural, infrastructure and financing cooperation, bilateral trade promotion, and on the development of economic and trade cooperation.
I would like to thank the government of China for this well-organized meeting. We are always happy to come and join our Chinese friend, both bilaterally and within the forum, the China-Africa Forum, which is a good framework to discuss political issues, economic issues, investment, trade between China and Africa.
Against the backdrop of unilateralism and rising protectionism, both Chinese and African officials believe it's time for them to boost the synergy between the Chinese proposed Belt and Road Initiative with the African Union 2063 agenda, and it's time for them to safeguard multilateralism and also to boost the closer community with the shared future between China and Africa.
Over 1,000 Chinese A-shares will be included in what the FTSE Russell calls a secondary emerging market index. This is the FTSE's first phase inclusion of Chinese shares, which is to run until March 23rd next year. The first phase is expected to bring in roughly $10 billion in passive foreign investments. The People's Bank of China says foreign investors held $244 billion worth of A-shares at the end of March this year, 3% of the total market cap, and a significant jump from previous years. China A-shares inclusion in the FTSE Russell will increase the percentage of foreign ownership in the market, and is also expected to have an impact on the balance of investments.
The stocks selected by the FTSE Russell are primarily stocks available on the Shanghai Hong Kong and Shenzhen Hong Kong Stock Connect. 60% of them are listed in Shenzhen. That means the FTSE Russell is focused more on China's medium and small-sized companies because their shares are more active.
The FTSE Russell Index is fully owned by the London Stock Exchange, and the A-shares inclusion at this time is seen as part of the country's deepening cooperation with the United Kingdom.
China will now have more financial connections to the United Kingdom. The Shanghai London Stock Connect made it possible to trade stocks from both sides, while the inclusion in the FTSE Russell will bring in more foreign capital. The inclusion is an important milestone in China's financial cooperation with foreign markets, and should be seen as a successful example for market players to learn from in the future.
More connections are expected to come. The 10th China-UK Economic and Financial Dialogue, which ended last week, announced that a mutual fund worth £1 billion is expected to be established by the China Investment Corporation and HSBC to help British companies expand business in the Chinese market. The FTSE Russell website says plans for further inclusion of A shares in its indexes will be based on the outcome of Phase 1 and future market developments.
This is where chocolate begins, on cacao trees. On this plantation in the state of Pará, in the Brazilian Amazon, it's time for harvest. It's an all-manual operation, from picking the fruits and cutting them one by one to extracting the pulp and, above all, the seeds from which chocolate is ultimately made. This farm has 50,000 producing trees with a yearly output of almost 100 metric tons of cocoa beans.
There's always a market for cocoa, sometimes not at its best price, but if you have a bag of cocoa, you can certainly sell it any time. And it can be stocked also. You don't have to sell it right after harvest, so it's also possible to wait for a better price if that's the case. Our next task here in our region is to invest in more quality and better varieties to make fine chocolates.
Cacao seeds are sun-dried for a few days and turned periodically for an even process that renders them into cocoa beans. They are then laid to rest in covered storage before being packed and shipped for final processing. Most go to chocolate factories, but other customers include businesses in the cosmetics and pharmaceutical industries.
Demand for chocolate has been growing worldwide and is expected to continue in this path over the coming years. Brazilian producers are hoping and preparing to reap the benefits of this trend, and have been looking to China as one of their most promising markets.
Here in the experimental plantation and laboratories of the government's Executive Committee for Cocoa Culture, CEPLAC, new techniques are studied to increase yields and the quality of the country's cocoa output. The state of Pará, home to the center, has recently become Brazil's main producer of cocoa.
The world cocoa market has been growing a lot. World chocolate processors say in the next 5 years there will be an additional demand for 1 million metric tons of cocoa beans, and they don't know where it will come from.
Adding value to production is another challenge. A group of growers in the Pará region created a cooperative to develop their own brand of chocolate. Cacau is still a relatively small operation, but they have already opened 8 shops in 3 Brazilian states, profiting the cocoa growers who joined the venture early on.
We have been trying to show producers that joining forces, for example, in a cooperative is the best way to improve our production.
Cocoa producers here in Pará trust in the power of people's sweet tooth and hope their love for chocolate will bring profits and development to this region for years to come.
Brent Christensen arrived at Peoria's federal courthouse on Monday, knowing that a jury would likely decide if he was guilty of kidnapping and killing Zhang Yingying. With Christensen's defense attorney having already admitted his client killed the Chinese scholar, the jurors were expected to render a quick verdict. In closing statements, Christensen's attorneys again made clear their client was responsible for the kidnapping and death of 26-year-old Zhang, whose body has never been recovered. It's Brent's fault, federal defender Elizabeth Pollock told the court as Christensen sat with his eyes closed. It's nobody's fault but his. But she said Christensen was not a serial killer. His attorneys already appear to be laying the groundwork for the sentencing phase. The jury took a little under 2 hours to come to a decision. The verdict, perhaps unsurprisingly, was unanimous. Guilty on all 3 charges. And Christensen now faces the death penalty. In the meantime, some satisfaction for Zhang's family that justice was served. But they know nothing can be done to bring Zhang back. Afterwards, the family told me they still want answers to the events of 2 years ago.
I am very touched today. Thanks very much to the jury. I really miss my daughter. I want to take her home. I want to take her home.
We want him to confess as soon as possible, so the most important thing is to tell us where Yingying is. And our biggest hope is finding Yingying and taking her home.
The sentencing phase will begin in 2 weeks. The same jury will decide whether Christensen will spend the rest of his life behind bars or sentenced to death.